So, this is a story about some of my rental properties that we bought. And this one's going to focus on how we took one property and basically turned it into six without having to put down any down payments on any of the other five houses that we bought. So, basically, we started with this house here in the center, and we later were able to buy this house over here. Then we were able to buy this duplex over here. Then later, we bought this house over here, and then we bought this 5-unit apartment building down here. And all these properties that we bought, except for the original, we didn't put down any down payment out of our pocket. In fact, we pocketed money at closing on most of these properties. So let's go through these one at a time. Basically, we bought this in the mid 1990s. So this was the oldest house we bought. At one point, we sold all of our rental properties except for this one. And we kept this one because we had a relative living there. We didn't want to sell it. And then we got back into buying properties. Over the years, we always kept this one. So we bought this in the mid 1990s, and it was single family, 3-bedroom, 1 bath. At the time, we paid about 20,000 for it. It was worth about 35,000 after we made some updates to it. For this particular house, we paid a little extra on the mortgage, and we probably paid it off within 10 years. I don't remember exactly because at the time, I didn't realize what I was doing with this property. I didn't realize this was going to turn into a house that we would use to buy more houses. That wasn't part of my plan at the time. So let's look at the next house here. So we'll fast forward maybe about 20 years. Now, in that 20 years, we had bought and sold several other properties. They were typically traditional ways. We bought some things on contract with no money down, and we would hold that house for a year or two. We'd have a 1 or 2 year balloon, and then we would go to the bank, refinance it, pay off the person we were buying it from, and borrow 100% at that point because we'd had equity paid down and had done some work. So there's all types of things we did in the past, but we didn't use that first house for anything until about 20 years later. But the important thing is, even though it was 20 years for us, we had that paid off in 10 years. And when I look back, we might have used equity in it to buy some other houses along the way, but I can't really remember if we did or not. But anyhow, about 10 years ago, we stumbled upon this house here and it needed some work. And I was working as a teacher, so I had summers off and I was looking for a project to do one summer. So my wife and I decided to buy this little house and spend the summer redoing it. So we bought it in 2015, 3-bedroom, 1 bath. We paid 22,000 for it. And I'll mention here that we are about 100 miles west of Chicago in rural Illinois. Prices are reasonably cheap. Real estate taxes are high, but property prices are relatively cheap compared to the rest of the country. So we paid 22,000 for this. We put about $6,000 into it, fixing it up, and we had borrowed 30,000. So this is where things get a little bit interesting. So people are like, how do you borrow 30,000 on a house that you only paid 22,000 for? I went to my bank and I said, "Hey, look at this house." And I said, "Hey, we got this other house over here, house number 1." And I'll keep referring to this as property number 1. So this is property number 1. So I told the bank, "We got this property number 1 here. We don't owe any money on it. Can we use that as equity to borrow extra for this house?" And they said, "Yeah, sure." The only extra cost there was they wanted to appraise property number 1, which wasn't a big deal. It was like $200 at the time, maybe. And the bank had their own in-house appraisal service. So I won't say it was an informal appraisal. They went in, they measured things, took pictures, but it wasn't a third party appraisal. So they probably did it cheaper that way, which is fine for us. So anyhow, we used the equity property number 1 to pay the full amount plus the money to fix it up. And I think we borrowed even 30,000. And then after the work was done, we talked to the bank, and when they appraised it, they gave me an appraisal of what it was worth at that point, and then what it would be worth after we fixed the things that we said we were gonna fix. We gave them a list of things we were gonna do. They said, "If you do all these things, it'd be worth like 40,000." So when the work was done, it was appraised for 40,000. At that point, I contacted the bank. They said, "Okay, you have 75% equity in this house. We'll release the lien on the first property." So now we have 2 properties. First house is free and clear again, and we have a $30,000 loan on this property here. So about a year or 2 later, our daughter was looking for a house about 70 miles away in Davenport, Iowa. She single mom, 1 income, eliminate a lot of the properties that she could probably afford on her own. But we stumbled across this house here. It was in a foreclosure from a bank, and we offered 60,000 for it. It needed a lot of work. It needed $20,000 worth of work. We bought it. We actually put our daughter on the deed and the title along with us. So it was 3 bedroom, 1 bath. We paid 60,000, needed 20,000 to fix it up. We borrowed 80,000, turned around and spent that money to fix it up. We did about 50% of the work ourselves and then hired out some of the work such as a new driveway, a new furnace, and we had the walls textured. Then we did all the flooring, put new doors in, all the painting, and pretty much everything else ourselves. I put a new water heater in myself. So once again, it was a summer project. We did a lot of work to it. We used the property from number 1 as collateral to buy this property. After the work was done, I signed a quick claim deed on the house. So we did this in conjunction with the bank. Same time, my daughter refinanced in her name only for 80,000. The loan we had was for a commercial property rental type loan, so the interest rate was a little bit higher. So my daughter refinanced it as a home loan, was able to borrow 80,000 because it appraised for 125,000. So she was able to borrow 80%. She could have borrowed more, but basically we just went to pay off the what we had borrowed originally, how much money we had invested into it. So we closed on it. Everything was fine and dandy. This is now our daughter's home. She gained about $45,000 in instant equity. So a lot of that equity was sweat equity. Probably 20,000 of it was our time and labor that I don't really put a price tag on. I should, but I don't. So once again, property 1 was free and clear again. So that was property number 3. Property number 4. So a funny thing happened. 2017, I was offered a job in the state of Utah. We're from Illinois. We sold the home that we lived in, which isn't part of this story, really. And then we bought a house in Utah. We ended up buying a couple of houses in Utah, and those aren't part of the story either. This story is all about the 1 house turning into 6 houses. So we moved to Utah, bought a house there, but we wanted a place in Illinois that we could stay at when we come back to visit. Now, our regular home was too much of a house to leave empty for part-time living. So what we did, we found this duplex here. We made an offer on it. We bought it. We had 2 units. Most duplexes do. So 2 units. We left 1 unit vacant, and it was furnished. And that would be our Illinois residence when we came back to Illinois to visit for extended periods of time. When we bought this, we didn't know how handy that would be because COVID came along and my job became remote. And so we were able to come to Illinois for extended periods of time, like 2, 3 weeks at a time. And then we had a place to stay of our own. We didn't have to inconvenience family and things like that. So we bought this duplex, had 2 two-bedroom, 1 bath units. We paid 65,000 for it. It didn't really need much. We put $1,000 into it initially. We had the carpets professionally shampooed. My wife bought some paint, just some odds and ends, nothing major. We borrowed 65,000. It appraised for 80,000. In reality, it was probably worth 110,000 based on the county had it assessed at and some different things. So once again, we used the equity from property number 1 in order to borrow 100%. So we actually borrowed the full 65,000 on it. We might have borrowed a little bit more to cover the closing costs. Can't remember for sure, but anyhow, we didn't pay anything out of pocket. So shortly after we closed on it, I asked the bank to release the lien on the property. I think we did have to pay a couple extra thousand toward the mortgage to get it down to the 75% threshold because this was still considered commercial property instead of a regular home loan. Looking back, I probably could have got a regular home loan on it, probably could have got a better interest rate and borrow 80%. But with the commercial loans in the bank I'm working with and using another piece of rental property as collateral, it was fast and easy to do it this way. So no regrets. It was totally fine. And we actually paid this off within a couple years. So property number 5, so we were living in Utah. We were back at Christmas time about 2020. This was before COVID hit. And just a few blocks from our duplex, I was driving around. I drove past this house. It was empty, had a for sale sign. I wasn't looking for property. Managing and owning property out of state can be inconvenient. And we already had a few properties that we were trying to manage. And during COVID, like I said, this was right before COVID. So I didn't know of the troubles that would come in the next few months when COVID finally hit. So we bought this like in February. COVID really hit around March, I believe, of that year. So anyhow, the house, single family, 2 bedroom, 1 bath. What was intriguing was it was for sale for 21,000. It was probably worth double that. So we paid 21,000. We borrowed 27,000. We put 6,000 into it, mostly for some flooring. We did pretty much gut the bathroom and put new fixtures in the bathroom, new sink, new toilet, new floor, and then some carpet. And we did a lot of that work ourselves over a 2-week period. We came back early February from Utah and spent 2 weeks working on this house, fixing it up. So once again, we used equity in property number 1 in order to borrow more than what we paid for it. Same thing after closing, they asked the bank to release the lien. They wanted proof that we fixed it up. This did need quite a bit of cosmetic work done to it. We took pictures, right, emailed them, and they released the lien on property number 1. I was looking for a property that had a large garage, like a 2, 3, or 4-car garage or 2 garages because we had things here in Illinois that we needed to store. I didn't want to pay for storage, but I thought if I could buy a rental house that had a huge garage, I could store some other things in this garage. So remember that's why I initially saw this house. Even though this house didn't even have a garage, the price and everything just seemed too good to pass up. So we just kind of stumbled on that. The realtor, he contacted me and said, I know of a property that has 2 2-car garages. And I said, I'd be interested. He said, "You might not be interested because it's a 5-unit apartment building." I said, "What?" "Okay." So, anyhow, next we are buying a 5-unit apartment building. So, shortly after we bought that single family, and this was during the early part of COVID, but I think the person that had this was looking to retire, get out of rental property. He didn't want to sell it the traditional way and have thousands of people go stopping through these people's apartments during COVID, all this type of thing. So we worked a deal. I looked at a couple of the units. He assured me that they all were similar, and they were. So 5 units, had 4 2-bedroom, 1-bath units, and one bedroom, 1-bath unit. We paid 142,500 for it. It didn't need much at all. We did put $1,000 into it. That was mostly some painting. There was 2 apartments that were actually empty when we bought it. So while they were empty, we went ahead and did some painting and got those looking nice. We borrowed 145,000, and what we did, we actually borrowed the closing cost. So we didn't have to put any money down, and the building's worth about 200,000. So once again, we used equity from property number 1 in order to borrow more than what we paid for it. So between what it appraised for and the extra equity, or lien on that other property, we came in easily under the 75% that the bank would lend us toward a property. So this one here was the last rental that we bought. We never got around to asking for the property, number one, to have the lien release because we ended up selling this property before that came about. So jump ahead here. We actually have sold all these properties except for the duplex. So the duplex we will keep as a home base after we're fully 100% retired and live in one of the units and then rent the other unit to somebody who can be the caretaker of the house when we're gone. So somebody who can make sure the heat is on, the water's working fine. So if we're gone for a month or 6 weeks or 2 months at a time, we know that the house is being taken care of. Since it's a duplex, that should be easy to do. So earlier I said that I was going to come back to something, and that has to do with equity and paying things off. So we had this first house here in the center, and we had paid that off over time, probably a more traditional amount of time, like 10 years perhaps. And so that was free and clear. When we bought this house here, we had a payment, and I can't remember what the payment was, but we were collecting rent of two properties. So a lot of people have cash flow. They have one house, one rent payment, and they have cash flow, maybe not much. Maybe they're breaking even. So it's hard to pay extra on the mortgage and get things paid off. We were fortunate that we had two payments basically coming in and one mortgage. So we doubled up and we paid extra on this house here. And we actually paid it off quite quickly. I can't remember exactly how quick, but I'm guessing probably within 3 years. This was the one that our daughter refinanced and it became her house, which she later sold for like 125,000 and then bought another house. And when she sold the house, she was able to use the money that she made from that. She actually gave us some of that money to pay for our labor, although that wasn't the plan originally. We had spent for our sweat labor, but she was able to pay off a car and student loans and then be debt free, except for the new house that they bought. At this point, we had these two houses. I believe both were paid off at this point. So when we bought the duplex for 65,000, we had two rents coming in from the duplex. We had a mortgage of 65,000, but we had four rent checks coming in one mortgage. So once again, we were able to pay extra on this, and within 3 years or so, we had that pretty much paid off. We actually paid this off about the time we stumbled upon this house over here. We bought this house and the mortgage was only 27,000 maybe in that range. So we were able to pay this house off very quickly also, maybe within a year or two. So at this point we had rent coming in here, rent from here, two rent checks here, and rent over here. So we had five rent checks coming in and one mortgage. So you hear about Dave Ramsey and the snowball effect of paying off loans. Dave Ramsey says pay off the smallest loans first, and then when you get that paid off, then double up on your next lowest loan and just keep doubling up, create a snowball effect and pay off all these loans. So basically that's what we did with these rental houses. So at that point, we still had this mortgage on here when we bought the fiveplex, but shortly after we bought the fiveplex, this had a pretty decent positive cash flow on its own. So combine these rents with these other rents, this house was paid off quite quickly, probably within a year or a year and a half, we paid this house off. Now, at this point, we're still living in Utah, and 6 years has gone by. We lived in Utah. We did move back to Illinois, bought another house in Illinois. We didn't use this house to buy it. We actually had money from selling properties in Utah. We bought a couple properties in Utah too and sold those, and we got lucky, bought before the market exploded, before COVID, and sold after the market kinda went crazy. So, we were able to buy a house here, no problem. So, at that point, we only had 1 mortgage, and that was for this property here, which we were starting to double up on that mortgage, and the plan was to pay extra on this for the time being. And for the longest time, I was looking at more houses, more properties. But as I got closer to retirement and we travel more, we decided we're at the point where these were starting to take too much of our time managing everything. And there was a fire in our local town. And I was thinking to myself, if we were traveling and one of our properties have a fire or something like this happen, it would be such a a- anxiety nightmare. I was thinking about selling at that point where I decided that I think it's time to sell everything. I was thinking we're getting ready to retire. I don't want to be worried about properties back home when we're traveling across Europe or South America and then not have people here to help us. So we decided to sell everything. But in the meantime, I had been dabbling in selling covered calls on some of the stocks that I had, some of the ETFs I had in some of my retirement funds and my IRAs and some different things, making some extra money doing that. And then I start looking at covered call ETFs and income ETFs. And I started running some numbers and doing some thinking. And I was thinking to myself, like, if I sold one of these properties for 70,000 and I took that money and put it into a covered call ETF that was returning maybe 12 to 20% per year. When you do the numbers, the ETFs is a better deal as far as not having the headaches. Based on the retirement money that I had invested and how that was returning, we decided let's sell all of our rental properties and just put that money into income ETFs and see how that does. So that's basically what we have done. So if you're following my other series, this is actually the house over here. It's painted blue now, but that's the house that I'm doing experiment and making videos on how it's performing. The other money is in some ETFs that are more conservative. They're between like 8, 12% return, not the 20 to 35% return that you're seeing in this other experiment that I'm doing online. Also, I'm not using margin with some of this other stuff, these other accounts I have. I'm only using margin with the account that you see that I'm making videos with. So, anyhow, I had mentioned that I would explain how I accumulated some properties with one single property kind of turned it into 6. This is a rundown how I did that. If anybody has any questions, go ahead and ask me. Got any specific questions about any of the certain properties I'm willing to share. I may go back and do a little bit of a dive on several other properties that we bought over the years. We bought things on contract. Actually wrote a deal standing next to my dumpster of an apartment building we had. A guy who had a rental across the street had people move out. He had 10 bags of garbage. He came over and asked me if he paid me $10 if he could throw those garbage bags in my dumpster. I told him, just go ahead and throw them in there. And then he was telling me about the property, how he was sick of it and everything else. And I said, can I look at it? And we walked across the street. I walked through it. I said, why don't you just sell this to me for 20,000 on contract? And he stuck his hand out and we shook on it. And I said, wait a minute here, let's figure this out. We walked over to my truck. I got a piece of paper out and we took a pen. I wrote down some of the details that we would have. And with those details, I took to my lawyer. He made it into a formal proposal. The guy came over to the lawyer's office the next day or a couple of days later. He signed it and I bought a house. So you never know. So that wraps up my story here. If you like the story and want to hear more, leave a comment. and be sure to subscribe to my channel if you haven't. Tell me. I don't wanna make videos just to hear myself talk. Alright, so that wraps it up. So be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoy this type of thing.